Hi, today I'll be coding something starting from this animation, not exactly the same thing because I want to showcase something a little different, but it is going to have the same starting point. So let's get to coding. We're going to have a square grid. This means that we're going to have the same number of rows and columns, which we set to 10. We're going to compute a total number of tiles on the grid, which is going to be n times n. Everything is going to be within the body, obviously. Here we're going to loop, and while p gets decremented and is still positive, we create our tile elements. Now, in a style attribute on the body, we're going to pass that n to the CSS as a custom property. Now, the CSS is going to use this n to create a grid of n rows and n columns. So when we update it here, when we update n here, we don't need to make any changes to the CSS. The number of rows and columns of the grid changes automatically. Now, if you've seen my previous videos, then you know I like to do this. On the body and on all div elements, set display grid. On the body, we're also going to set a grid template. But first, let's set an edge length. So we're going to use a clamp function, for which we don't even have autocomplete. A minimum of 2 ems, and the preferred value is going to be in viewport units, so that everything scales nicely, a maximum of 8 ems. And as I said before, we're going to have grid template columns. Repeat, n is the number of columns, and the column width is going to be that tile edge length. So speaking of tiles, we're going to set the height to that same edge length, L. And let's see something. Okay, that's a mess. So we're going to set a grid gap. Yeah, if I could type, that would be great. Grid gap. 2 pixels, we don't need more, just to see where one tile ends and the next one begins. Okay, now let's place this in the middle. So we're going to use place content center. This seems to only work horizontally, but the thing is the body takes the height of its content at this point. So we need to set its height or min height to the full viewport height. This creates an ugly scroll bar, and that's because the body has a margin. But if we zero the margin, then that scroll bar disappears. Okay, now we're not going to write any JS. And let's make the background a bit more interesting. So let's say it's going to be a linear gradient to minus 45 degrees, that's top left corner. And we're going to have transparent up to 50% in the middle. And then we're going to have sharp transition to gray. So like that. Okay. We're also going to use some pseudo elements here, so before and after. That's why we also set display grid on the div elements, so the tiles are divs. Okay, so here nothing's going to show up unless we set content, and we're going to take this background and we're going to use it right here. So we're going to want to differentiate between those two. But first, you can see that the before is on the first row and after is on the second row. And we want them to be stacked. That is, the tile grid is going to be a one cell grid. Both the before and the after are going to be in that one same cell, defined by the grid area at the intersection between the first row and first column. So we're going to have grid area, first row, first column. Okay, so I said earlier about differentiating. We're going to use a switch custom property, which is initially 0, but then on the after, it gets switched to 1. So it got switched to 1. If I could type, that would be great. Okay, now here, we're going to change that angle. So we're going to use a calc, and I times, and we can use either 180 degrees or half a turn. So half a turn, it's the same thing, minus 45 degrees, and we're going to use 2 different grays. So we're going to use an HSL value. The hue doesn't matter for gray. The saturation is always 0 for grays, and for the lightness we're going to use a base of 65 degrees, 65%, sorry, and here we're going to subtract I times 8% at first. Okay, now the thing is, we can also compute a sign here. It's not quite the sign of I, it's more like -1 to the power of I plus 1 or -1. So we don't yet have exponential in CSS. Well, it is in the spec, but no browser implements it. So here we are going to use this little trick. So 2 times I minus 1. This gives us minus 1 if I is 0 and 1 if I is 1. So we can use that right here. And let's align stuff nicely. Okay, I don't like those jagged edges, so let's take care of that. So here we're going to use calc 50% minus 1 pixel, and here we're going to have 50%, and that's a much nicer, smoother edge right there. Okay, so having done this, let's move to animating things. So we're going to have keyframes, and this is going to be a scaling transform. So to transform scale, we scale down to 0, and here we are going to set an animation duration, let's say 1 second, and here we can also set a background, not quite black but still pretty dark. So let's say it's going to be something like this, and we can collapse the body then, and then we can go here and have an animation. So it's going to be that scaling animation, use that T duration. Ease in out, we want something symmetrical, infinite, and alternate, and this should do it. We should see stuff moving. Okay, much nicer. Now let's play with transform origin a bit. So let's say we're going to have calc I times 100%, and something like this. It's not quite what we had there, so we're also going to compute the negation, the complementary, the inverse, whatever you want to call it, the inverse. Well, however you want to call that. 1 minus I. So basically when I is 0, not I is 1, and when I is 1, not I is 0. So we can use not I right here. Okay, now we're going to want an animation delay, and to do that we're going to need to add a style element here, and within it we're going to have a loop. So for let I going from 0 all the way up to n, increment this. So here we're going to have tile nth of type, and it's nth of type and not nth child, because style is a sibling of the tiles and it comes before them, so it's going to mess up nth child. So here it's going to be every n tiles plus, and here we have plus 1, because the nth of type index is 1 based as opposed to loop index, which is 0 based. And here we're going to set the column index to the loop index, and then we're going to have something similar for the rows. So we're not going to go every n tiles, we're going to go after all the tiles on the previous rows, and we're going to set a loop index j right there. Now here we'll be computing a middle index. So this is basically the average between the first index 0 and the last one n minus 1. So that's 0 plus n minus 1 over 2, or times 0.5, whichever you prefer. So that's going to be calc 0.5 times n minus 1. Now we're going to compute the absolute value of the difference between this middle index and the current column and row indices. So we're going to have, for the columns, this is going to be the maximum between m minus I and I minus m. So if I is smaller than m, then this is positive and this is negative, and we take the positive one because that's the bigger one. And if I is bigger than m, this is negative and this is positive, and we take the positive one because that's the bigger one. So we always get the absolute value of this difference. Now we're going to have the exact same thing for the rows. only we're going to change that I into J. Now these absolute values can be between 0, and that's for the tiles in the middle, right? Because those have the indices equal or very close to M. So that's going to give us 0 or very close to 0. It's going to give us 0 for odd numbers of columns and rows, and very close to 0 for even ones. And if we divide these absolute values by M, then these ratios are going to be in the 0, 1 intervals. And if we add these two ratios for the row and for the column, then their sum is going to be in the 0, 2 interval. Knowing that, we're going to compute the animation delay, and we're going to use the sum of those ratios, and we're going to bring out the denominator, which is M and which is in common. So let's do just that. Plus, and we said we bring out that denominator, and we multiply this with the animation duration. Oh yeah, of course. Okay, but as you can see, we want for all the tiles the animation to be started at the very beginning, and that means we can subtract an animation duration from this to make all the delays negative. But that means that if we subtract t, so if we add a minus t there, we can bring out that t out. So we can bring out that t, and we're going to have that minus 1. Actually, so this adds up to 2. So we should subtract 2 from there. Okay, that's much better. So yeah, I'm not going to tweak it any further. I'm going to leave it here. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you like the work that I'm putting out since early 2012 and you want me to be able to do more in the future, please consider supporting it. You can do so by being a cool cat and becoming a patron on Patreon, or if monthly support is not your style, there's the option of a one-time donation, or you can make me happy with a gift off my wish list. The links for everything, my Patreon, the one-time donation, or my Amazon wish list, and as well as this demo or any other resources that may be useful, are going to be in the description. Or you can at least share this to show the world what can be done in CSS these days, because honestly, I think it's pretty damn cool. In any event, thanks for watching, and until next time, bye!